The Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, has cancelled a planned tour of the West Bank after comments he made in Israel against the BDS movement. Johnson arrived in the region on Sunday and was scheduled to visit the region, as well as Israel and Jerusalem. The cancellation yesterday came following comments made by the London mayor in the Israeli city of Tel Aviv, in which he hit out at the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, deriding its supporters as left-wing academics.
I cannot think of anything more foolish than to say that you want to have any kind of divestment or sanctions or whatever, or boycott against a country that, when all is said and done, is the only democracy in the region. The supporters of this so-called boycott are really just a bunch of, corduroy-jacketed academics from, lefty. Not anything wrong with wearing a corduroy jacket.
His comments were not well received in Palestinian territories, and the London mayor cancelled most of his visit to the region after various organisations cancelled their invitations, with Johnson only holding a handful of meetings, including with the Palestinian Prime Minister, before cutting his visit short.
Now joining me to discuss that last story is Murad Qureshi from the Greater London Assembly and Amena Saleem from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Murad, Boris, not for the first time perhaps, has made a bit of an idiot himself here, hasn't he?
Certainly. It's interesting how he's suddenly taken to travelling quite a bit. It's come into the last 6 or 7 months of his time there. On this occasion, it seemed at first appearance, and we heard about it over the weekend, that Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories was what it was billed as, that they had some kind of idea of a balance. But clearly his mouth got in the way when he was in Tel Aviv and made those derogatory remarks. I mean, for the first things first, he's factually incorrect. Israel's not the only democracy in the Middle East. We've got Tunisia, Turkey. They've both had presidential elections recently. And if anything, actually, Israeli democracy is a very perverse form of PR, which means, actually, unfortunately, the settlers and religious groups have more control over Israeli politics than I think is healthy.
I mean, presumably if the BDS movement, if the support for it were limited to lefty academics wearing corduroy jackets, it wouldn't be quite as big a problem as Boris Johnson seems to think it is. Tell us a little bit about the actual extent of support for BDS.
Well, it's global support, it's international, and what Johnson did when he dismissed it out of hand, he also dismissed the Palestinian people who've called for that boycott, because in the application of international law isn't taking place. So it's something that does really scare the Israeli state, because it is such a global movement. And it's been taken up not just in the UK but across the world. And huge companies like G4S, Veolia have been targeted, as well as goods coming from the settlements, Israeli goods. And it's something that has affected the Israeli economy, and that's shown in figures every year. And just yesterday, the EU said that all goods coming from settlements have to be labelled in all EU member countries. So now consumers are going to have even more of a choice as to whether they want to buy stolen goods that have been grown or come from stolen land, i.e. the settlements. And yes, that will help to extend the boycott as well. So, the Israeli state has good reason to be afraid of boycott of BDS. And somebody like Johnson, Boris Johnson, when he makes these remarks, when he's trying to dismiss it, he's trying to be funny. But actually, he also is showing his fear that, BDS is working very effectively against Israel's apartheid regime.
I mean, actually, Murad, when we said it's true that he cancelled his visits, but actually, rather the truth is that Palestinians cancelled their meetings with him because, as Amena says, they're the people driving this. The BDS was a Palestinian Society initiative, wasn't it?
Indeed, and I think it's important to not understate that actually it was Palestinian groups, the youth, women entrepreneurs and engineers who had set up a workshop on affordable housing that withdrew the invites, and the Palestinian Prime Minister said, well, we can't guarantee you security as a result of that. So actually I think Boris was clearly shown the door and he's got to acknowledge. I think what
did he actually cancel anything at all, or is this just spin? Did he then go on to cancel other meetings?
I suspect suddenly the diary became much freer, and he found himself wondering what to do with himself. I will certainly be asking questions when I get into City Hall about this and find out what really did happen. But it just shows his inability to actually see some of the realities. Anyone who goes to the West Bank, you can't ignore the wall of separation. It makes the Berlin Wall look puny. You can't ignore the check-in points in and out of the West Bank and the general misery of life under occupation. Boris didn't have any sense of that there or before he went out, and I think that's very well reflected in the comments he made, offhand comments, which didn't reflect a real understanding of what's going on out there.
I mean, you might dismiss those particular comments about academics and corduroy jackets as Boris being, his usual.
Well, I'm used to hearing those kind of
flippant and
things. But the Palestinians aren't, and I think they're right to take offence.
Yeah, no doubt, it was a shock for them. But he also made some what one supposes are more considered comments about Winston Churchill and how Winston Churchill had foreseen a time when Jews and Arabs would be living together, and he didn't seem to get that this was probably a rather more serious point, and at least as difficult for a Palestinian audience to take as the more flippant stuff.
Indeed, and in some ways the parallels with Churchill doesn't go down well in all parts of the world. I can certainly say in South Asia, where his track record there isn't as good as Churchillian supporters like Boris would like to admit. But coming back to the Middle East, I mean, there was a time in Palestine where Arabs and Jews would have rubbed shoulders, and that was actually precedes
before Churchill got to work.
Yes, indeed. So actually, it's I'm not sure which period of time he's referring to. If I had an exchange with him, I would put that straight quite happily.
I mean, you mentioned that European decision to label goods coming in. Just talk us through what is the change there, and what will it mean, and why was the reaction, because there was a very strong reaction from the Israeli state about that as well?
Well, the UK government already introduced guidelines a few years back, and they were voluntary for supermarkets, shops to label produce from the settlements. So what the EU guidelines have done is extended that across Europe. So that's huge because it's 28, 29 member states.
So what will it actually say?
Basically, anything, it applies, it's going to affect mostly fruit, vegetables, cosmetics, I think, as well. And anything that comes from a settlement, so an illegal Israeli settlement built on occupied Palestinian land, before Israel could export that stuff over, and it could just say made in Israel on it. So you'd think, maybe it came from sort of within those, exactly, within the 1967 borders. And, you didn't know it was, from the West Bank. But now that will have to be made clear. So, people who do not agree with the occupation, don't agree with the subjugation of the Palestinian people, they can look at this and say, this came from a settlement, I'm not buying it. And, and that's why it's got the Israeli government so riled up.
And when that happened, presumably that did happen with some goods when it was just a guideline and not an EU enforceable one. Did that boost the number of people participating in the boycott because consumers could more easily see? And do you expect that to happen again now?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time consumers are given a choice, they'll make the right choice. And I know the work we do at Palestine Solidarity Campaign, people always want more labelling, not less labelling. And they'll write to their supermarkets and they'll say, we want to know exactly where these products came from. Are they from settlements? Are they from Israel? When you've got 3 peppers in a pack, say, for example, and it says assorted countries, they want to know the exact countries that they came from. So, they can make sure that they're not buying Israeli goods, settlement goods. And I think, this move by the EU, it's a step forward, and it will help consumers.
And is it mandatory? Or is this just an extension of guidelines?
It's an extension. So, it's just a step forward. It's not the complete answer. But it does show that we are moving forward all the time. Rather than stopping still or moving backwards, we're going forwards. And these are all things that we can build on. And, until hopefully we've come to a point where international law is applied and the occupation can end.
Murad, how accountable is Boris to the GLA when something like this kicks off? What powers does the GLA actually have to hold the mayor to account?
It's interesting. The people who put this programme together on London Partners, we did actually scrutinise them last week. We picked up no idea that this was happening until the weekend. I'm certainly keen to verbally ask him questions as well as written questions to explain his behaviour. And I think there are things that he needs to consider considerably. For example, the flippant comments. Whilst in the British context you can get away with it, I'm not so sure in a more sensitive climate like the Middle East and the West Bank that goes down as well. I'm not convinced he really thought through what he was doing there, and I get the sense in the 9 months of his morality, he's trying to do as much travelling and earn as much air miles as he can for his future career as a challenger for the Tory leadership. I think that's more on his mind than actually running London and getting on with things that need to be done.
Yeah, is that a symptom of a morality which is now lost direction, do you think?
It has for some time, actually. I mean, but certainly now in this last 6 months between now and May, when the next contest, he's on his way out. We know he's not actually the person who's making critical decisions. If anything, a future mayor, whoever that may be, is not going. Any decision he makes now, they'll review immediately after May and say, "Well, actually, I'm not so keen on that, possibly." So yes, there is a sense that the Boris show is on its way out, and he's trying to get as much travel in as possible on the London Council taxpayer, and I think there's that, as well as his views and opinions that he expresses on the platforms he gets, which needs to be challenged, and I will look at every opportunity to do that.
Amena, presumably those remarks that Boris made about lefty academics and whatnot, I mean, hard for us to say exactly what was in the mayor's mind, but hard perhaps for anybody to say what exactly was in the mayor's mind, but presumably he was thinking of the exchange of letters in the press that's taken place recently with some academics in favour of boycott, other academics expressing some considerable hostility, you'd have to say, to it. How do you read that debate? How do you think that discussion has gone in terms of the supporters of Palestinian Solidarity?
I think, because there was an advert in The Guardian last week, and that was signed initially by more than 300 academics who supported an academic boycott of Israeli institutions, and then that was countered later on in the week. You will always find, this counter-argument. If, the people who support Palestinian rights, human rights, they come forward and say, here are the reasons for boycott, you always will get a backlash. But what you find is, in that backlash, a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what boycott is actually about. So there are accusations flung about, like, you're boycotting people, innocent people, and you're not giving them a voice. Instead of dialogue, you're actually suppressing dialogue, and you're not going to get anywhere that way. And it's not like that at all. So what boycott, what BDS is actually about, is you're saying, we're not going to have anything to do with these institutions that are funded by the Israeli state, which are used by the Israeli state to promote Israel, which in the case of universities in Israel are involved in developing the technology that is then used against Palestinians in Gaza, the bombs that fall on them, the white phosphorus that's used on them, the drones that fly over constantly, that kind of thing. Because in those Israeli universities, you get grants specifically to develop that kind of military equipment. And you also, if you're a student at university and you want to take some time off and go into the Israeli army, you'll receive credits for doing that on your course. So, these universities are actively aiding the suppression of the Palestinian people and the occupation. So what boycott is saying is, like, our universities here won't deal with those universities over there. We're not saying we're boycotting people, we're boycotting the institutions that help to maintain the occupation and are supported by the Israeli state with funding in so doing.
OK, Amena, Saleem. Murad, Qureshi, thanks very much for coming in, but I'm afraid we'll have to end that discussion there. Do join us for the final part of the programme, where we'll be having a look at a report on Ethiopia experiencing its worst drought in its history. Don't go away.